My boyfriend's friend convinced him I was too dumb for him because I was just a lab tech. So I ended her career. I'd been dating Nathan for 2 years and everything was great. We met at trivia night. Both aerospace engineers, both loved hiking and documentaries. I worked at a research lab designing satellite components while he did consulting for aviation companies. We had this easy rhythm where we'd cook together talking about our projects, help each other with problems, just genuinely enjoyed each other's minds. Then Nathan reconnected with his high school friend Melissa at some reunion. She was getting her PhD in theoretical physics and immediately started joining our hangouts. At first I tried being friendly. She'd talk about quantum mechanics and I'd ask questions, genuinely interested. But she'd answer like she was explaining to a 5-year-old, then turn to Nathan and say, "Wasn't it cute how I tried to understand?" Nathan would laugh it off, but I noticed she only did this when he was watching. When we went to dinner, she'd steer conversations to her research, then apologize for boring me with smart people stuff. I have 2 master's degrees. One night we're at trivia, and the category was space exploration. I answered every question right, since that's literally my job. Melissa told Nathan I probably just memorized facts without understanding them. Nathan actually agreed and said maybe we should give other teams a chance. I let it go, but started noticing Nathan questioning things he never had before. Like when I fixed our router, he asked if I really knew what I was doing or just got lucky. When I helped optimize code for his project, he double-checked it with Melissa. She told him there were errors. There weren't. The breaking point was Nathan's company party. I'm talking to his boss about propulsion systems when Melissa walks over and tells the boss I'm Nathan's girlfriend who works as a lab tech. The boss said he thought I was the engineer who published that paper on thermal management. Melissa laughed and said that must be someone else with my name since the math in that paper was pretty advanced. I corrected her, but she'd already moved Nathan away. In the car home, Nathan said Melissa was worried about our compatibility, that relationships work better when people are intellectual equals, and maybe I'd be happier with someone at my own level. I asked what level that was. He said Melissa noticed I struggled with abstract concepts and relied too much on practical application. This woman had convinced my boyfriend I was too dumb for him. I asked Nathan if he agreed with her. He said she'd made some valid points about our conversations being surface level. We'd spent last week discussing the philosophical implications of sending consciousness to Mars, but sure, surface level. I knew exactly what was happening, but decided to play the long game. Started acting confused when Nathan explained things, asked Melissa to slow down when she talked, even bought a bunch of those pop science books and left them around. Melissa ate it up, started calling me Nathan's sweet, simple girlfriend. Meanwhile, I started working on something special. See, Melissa's PhD advisor was Dr. Harrison, who I'd collaborated with on 3 papers. He didn't know she was friends with Nathan. I reached out about a new project involving quantum applications in satellite navigation. He was interested, and we started working together. Melissa had no idea her advisor was sending me her research to review, since my practical experience could strengthen her theoretical work. Here's the thing about her research. It was derivative. She'd taken existing frameworks and repackaged them with fancy math that obscured rather than illuminated. Her code was inefficient, and her conclusions didn't account for real-world variables. I wrote a thorough review pointing out every flaw, every missed citation, every place where practical application would prove her theories wrong. Dr. Harrison was horrified he'd missed all this. Then I found something worse. Whole paragraphs lifted from obscure Russian papers without attribution. Not enough to catch with standard plagiarism software, but enough to end a career. I documented everything and sent it to Dr. Harrison with my deep concerns about academic integrity. He called me immediately. The review board met that week. Melissa got called in thinking it was about her upcoming defense. Instead, they presented her with my findings. She tried arguing the similarities were coincidental, but I'd found 17 instances across 4 papers. Her funding got pulled immediately. She had 2 weeks to clean out her office. Nathan called me panicking because Melissa was having a breakdown saying someone sabotaged her. She couldn't figure out who since she'd made enemies of most grad students by constantly correcting them. Nathan said she needed support and asked if I could help despite everything. I said of course and went over with cookies and tea. Melissa's office smelled like stale coffee and printer toner. The space was barely bigger than a closet, crammed with bookshelves and papers stacked in messy piles on every surface. She sat hunched over her desk with her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking. The tea I'd brought sat untouched next to her laptop, steam rising in thin curls. I settled into the plastic chair across from her and watched her cry, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. She kept saying the same things over and over, how someone must have set her up, how the plagiarism findings were impossible, how she'd never stolen anything in her life. I nodded and made sympathetic sounds while my hands gripped my knees under the desk. Every time she looked up at me with those red, swollen eyes, I had to fight to keep my face concerned instead of satisfied. This was exactly what I'd wanted, what I'd carefully planned and worked toward for weeks. But sitting here watching her world collapse felt different from I'd expected. Not bad different, just strange. She wiped her nose with a tissue and started going through the review board's findings again, pointing at her computer screen like I could help her find some error in their logic. I leaned forward and looked at the document she was showing me, the same document I'd written myself, and pretended to read it for the first time. She asked if I saw anything wrong with their conclusions, and I told her it looked pretty thorough. Her face crumpled again and she put her head back in her hands. My phone buzzed in my pocket while Melissa was still crying. I pulled it out and saw Nathan's name on the screen. The message asked if Melissa had said anything about who might have reported her. I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. He had no idea. He was texting his girlfriend asking for information while I sat across from his friend whose career I'd just destroyed. I typed back that she was too upset to talk coherently, which wasn't a lie, and suggested he give her some space while the investigation continued. He sent back a worried face emoji and said he'd check in with her tomorrow. I put my phone away and looked at Melissa, who was now staring blankly at her computer screen. She asked if I thought Nathan would still want to be friends with her after this. I told her of course he would, that this didn't change who she was as a person. The words felt hollow coming out of my mouth, but she seemed to take comfort in them. She thanked me for coming over and said she didn't know what she'd do without support right now. I stayed for another 20 minutes, making tea and listening to her talk about her research and how many years of work were now completely wasted. When I finally left, she hugged me at the door and told me I was a good friend. The next week passed in a weird blur. Nathan kept texting me updates about Melissa, how she wasn't answering his calls or messages, how worried he was about her. He said she'd always been proud and this must be killing her. I agreed and said maybe she just needed time to process everything. We were sitting on his couch on Wednesday night when he brought it up again, asking if I thought he should drive over to her apartment and check on her. I told him that might make things worse, that she was probably too embarrassed to face anyone from her old life right now. He nodded but kept checking his phone like she might suddenly respond. On Thursday, he asked if I'd heard from her and I said no. Friday, he wondered out loud if maybe he should have seen the signs that something was wrong with her research. I bit my tongue and reminded him that he wasn't a theoretical physicist, that he couldn't have known. He seemed relieved by this and dropped the subject. By Saturday, he was asking me repeatedly if I thought she'd be okay, if academic fraud was something people recovered from, if her career was really over, or if she could start again somewhere else. I had to sit there and pretend I was equally concerned about her well-being, nodding and saying supportive things, while inside I felt this weird mix of triumph and guilt. The guilt surprised me. I'd expected to feel purely satisfied, but instead I kept seeing her face in that tiny office, the way her hands had shaken when she showed me the review board's findings. Monday morning, I went back to work at the research lab and tried to focus on my actual job. Kara found me in the break room around 10, pouring my third cup of coffee. She leaned against the counter and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but she kept looking at me with this concerned expression. She said I seemed different lately, more confident but also more guarded, like I was holding something back. I laughed it off and said work had just been stressful. She asked if everything was okay with Nathan, and I felt my smile freeze on my face. The question hit different from I'd expected because suddenly I was thinking about what all of this had revealed about my relationship. Nathan had believed Melissa over me. He'd questioned my intelligence, my competence, my ability to understand basic concepts in my own field. He'd done it so easily, so quickly. Like 2 years of knowing me counted for nothing compared to a few weeks of Melissa's comments. I realized I hadn't actually processed any of that yet. I'd been so focused on destroying Melissa that I hadn't stopped to think about what it meant that Nathan was, so ready to believe I was too dumb for him. Kara was still waiting for an answer, so I told her things with Nathan were complicated right now. She asked if I wanted to talk about it, but I said no. She squeezed my shoulder and went back to her desk. That night, Nathan came over to my apartment with takeout. We ate on the couch and watched some documentary about deep-sea creatures. Halfway through, he paused it and turned to me with this serious expression. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what Melissa had said regarding our intellectual compatibility. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. He continued, saying he was starting to wonder if maybe he'd been unfair to me. I asked what he meant by unfair. He shifted uncomfortably and said some of the things Melissa had pointed out, about me struggling with abstract concepts. Maybe those weren't actually true. Maybe he'd just been seeing what she wanted him to see. I felt anger rising in my chest like heat. He was only questioning his behavior now because Melissa had disappeared and couldn't reinforce her narrative anymore. Not because he'd recognized the problem himself. Not because he'd thought about it and realized how insulting his behavior had been. But because his source of information was gone. I asked him if he actually believed I struggled with abstract concepts. He hesitated and said he didn't know, that Melissa had been convincing. The anger got hotter. I asked if he remembered our conversation about consciousness and Mars exploration. He nodded. I asked if that had seemed surface level to him at the time, before Melissa told him it was. He looked uncomfortable and admitted it hadn't. I set my food down and stood up. Nathan asked where I was going and I told him nowhere. I just needed to move. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below. The decision formed in my mind fully shaped, like it had been waiting there all along. I turned around and told him I needed to tell him something. He put down his food too and sat forward. I explained calmly how I'd reviewed Melissa's research for Dr. Harrison, how I'd found the plagiarism, how I'd documented everything that led to her getting kicked out of the PhD program. The words came out steady and clear. I told him about reaching out to Dr. Harrison, about the quantum navigation project that was just an excuse to get access to her work, about finding the lifted paragraphs from Russian papers. I explained how I'd written the review that destroyed her career, how I'd been the one who reported her to the Academic Integrity Board. Nathan's face went completely white. He stared at me like I'd just told him I'd committed murder. The silence stretched between us for what felt like forever. Finally, he asked why I would do something so destructive. His voice was quiet. but I could hear the shock underneath. I walked back to the couch and sat down, keeping space between us. I reminded him of the router incident, when he'd asked if I really knew what I was doing or just got lucky. I listed the code review where he'd checked my work with Melissa even though I'd been programming longer than she had. I brought up the company party where she'd told his boss I was just a lab tech, where she'd laughed at the idea that I could have written that thermal management paper. I described the car ride home where he'd told me maybe I'd be happier with someone at my own level. I went through every single time he'd questioned my intelligence based on her lies. Each instance came out of my mouth like evidence in a trial. His face got paler with every example. When I finished, he tried to say something, but I held up my hand. I asked him about the conversation where he'd agreed that maybe we should give other teams a chance at trivia, because I probably just memorized facts. He closed his mouth and looked down at his hands. He started trying to defend himself, saying Melissa was convincing and had a PhD, that she seemed like an authority on intellectual matters. I cut him off before he could finish. I asked if my 2 master's degrees weren't convincing enough, if my published research papers weren't authority enough, if working in aerospace engineering for 6 years wasn't proof enough that I understood abstract concepts. My voice got louder with each question. I asked if he'd needed Melissa to tell him I was smart, or if maybe he should have figured that out from dating me for 2 years. The hurt on his face was obvious now. He looked like I'd slapped him. Good. He was finally understanding the depth of what he'd done to our relationship. He opened his mouth and closed it again. No words coming out. I waited. He finally said he didn't know what to say, that hearing it all laid out like that made him realize how badly he'd messed up. I told him it wasn't just that he'd messed up. It was that he'd been so easily convinced I was incompetent, that some woman he hadn't seen since high school could show up, and within weeks make him doubt my basic intelligence. Nathan asked if the plagiarism was real, or if I'd made it up to destroy her. The question made me so angry I had to take a deep breath before answering. I was genuinely offended that he was still doubting my professional integrity even now. I got up and went to my laptop, opened my email, and pulled up the files I'd sent to Dr. Harrison. I showed him the original Russian papers side by side with Melissa's work. I pointed out the identical paragraphs, the same sentence structures, the lifted equations. I walked him through all 17 instances across her 4 papers. I showed him how she'd changed just enough words to avoid automatic plagiarism detection, but kept the core ideas and frameworks without attribution. I made him read the passages himself, comparing them line by line. I watched his face as he realized her fraud was completely real, that I hadn't fabricated anything, that I'd just done my job as a reviewer and found what was actually there. He sat back and put his hands over his face. He said he was sorry, that he should never have questioned whether I'd made it up. I closed my laptop and told him the plagiarism was real, but that didn't change why I'd looked for it in the first place. We spent the next 3 hours talking through everything. Nathan apologized over and over, saying he didn't know how he'd let himself get manipulated like that. He admitted he'd gotten caught up in Melissa's confidence and his own insecurity about not having a PhD himself. He said he'd always felt like maybe he wasn't smart enough, like his consulting work was less impressive than research, and Melissa had played right into that fear. She'd made him feel included in some elite intellectual club by agreeing with her assessment of me. I listened to all of it and tried to figure out if I could forgive someone who was so easily convinced I was incompetent. Part of me understood that insecurity makes people do stupid things, but another part of me couldn't stop thinking about how quickly he'd turned on me, how readily he'd accepted her narrative. He asked what I was thinking, and I told him I didn't know yet. I said I needed time to process everything, to figure out if trust could be rebuilt after something like this. He nodded and said he understood, that he'd wait as long as I needed. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the documentary still paused on the TV, the takeout containers cold on the coffee table between us. I left Nathan's place after midnight and drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The conversation kept replaying in my head, how he'd looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in months. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch in the dark for an hour just trying to process everything. The next morning, I texted Nathan that I needed space to think about us. He responded immediately asking how much time I needed, and I told him honestly that I didn't know. He showed up at my door that evening with 2 boxes, his face pale and tired-looking. He'd packed up his things from my apartment without me having to ask. I watched him carry his spare work clothes from my closet, his extra toiletries from the bathroom, the book he'd been reading that lived on my nightstand. He moved quietly and carefully, like he was trying not to disturb anything. When he finished, he stood in my doorway holding both boxes and asked if this was really what I wanted. I told him it was what I needed right now. He nodded and left without arguing. After he was gone, I walked through my apartment, noticing all the empty spaces where his stuff had been. The bathroom counter looked bigger without his electric razor. The closet had a gap where his jackets used to hang. But weirdly, the apartment felt more like mine than it had in months. Like I'd been sharing it with someone who didn't really see me, and now I had room to breathe again. 3 days later, I was at work running simulations when an email from Dr. Harrison popped up. He thanked me for the thorough review of Melissa's research and said my attention to detail had been invaluable. Then he mentioned that 2 other graduate students had come forward with concerns about collaborative projects they'd worked on with Melissa. Apparently, my review had opened up a bigger investigation into her entire academic career. I sat staring at that email for a long time. Part of me felt satisfied, like I'd exposed something that needed to be exposed. But another part felt guilty knowing I'd triggered this whole thing. If I hadn't gone looking, if I hadn't been so angry about what she'd done to my relationship, would anyone have ever found the plagiarism? Would those other students have spoken up? I closed my email and tried to focus on work, but couldn't stop thinking about how one review had destroyed someone's entire career path. That Friday after work, Kara found me still at my desk at 7 p.m., staring at simulation results I wasn't really seeing. She asked if I wanted to grab drinks, and I said yes without even thinking about it. We ended up at this bar near the lab that we'd been to a few times for team happy hours. After we ordered, Kara asked what was going on because I'd seemed off all week. I hadn't planned to tell anyone the whole story, but it all came spilling out. The way Melissa had undermined me, how Nathan had believed her, finding the plagiarism, the academic investigation, everything. I expected Kara to be shocked or maybe judge me for what I'd done. Instead, she listened carefully, and then said I hadn't fabricated anything, that I'd just exposed fraud that would have been discovered eventually. She pointed out that Melissa's treatment of me had been its own kind of sabotage, trying to destroy my relationship and my boyfriend's respect for my work. Kara said if the plagiarism was real, then Melissa had done this to herself, that I'd just been the one who found it. Hearing someone else say that made me feel slightly better about the whole thing. The next Tuesday, Nathan texted asking if we could talk again. He said he'd been thinking a lot about his behavior, and realized the problem wasn't just about Melissa. He admitted he'd always felt kind of intimidated by my practical skills and hands-on expertise. That insecurity had made him vulnerable when someone came along claiming theoretical knowledge was superior. He said he wanted to talk more if I was willing. I stared at that text for an hour before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it and just move on. But another part needed to understand how we'd gotten to this point. I agreed to meet him for coffee that Saturday. When I got to the coffee shop, Nathan was already there at a corner table. He had a notebook in front of him, which seemed weird. After we ordered, he slid the notebook across to me. He'd written out a list of every time he remembered questioning my intelligence or abilities over the past 6 months. There were way more instances than I'd realized. Times he'd asked if I was sure about something technical. Moments where he'd double-checked my work. Conversations where he'd explained things I already knew. Some of them I'd completely forgotten about because they'd seemed small at the time. But seeing them all written out together showed a pattern that had started way before Melissa showed up. She hadn't created the problem. She'd just made it worse. I read through the whole list feeling this mix of hurt and anger building up again. Nathan watched me and didn't say anything until I finished. Then he asked if I thought we could fix this or if the damage was too deep. We spent the next 2 hours talking about our relationship foundation and whether it had ever been as solid as I'd thought. Nathan acknowledged he had serious insecurity issues around not having a PhD and doing consulting instead of research. He said he'd always worried he wasn't smart enough compared to people doing theoretical work. When Melissa came along talking about abstract concepts and quantum mechanics, it had made him feel included in some intellectual club. Agreeing with her assessment of me had been a way of proving he belonged in that space. I told him that was a pretty terrible reason to undervalue someone you supposedly loved. He agreed and said he knew it was messed up, that he needed to work on trusting his actual experiences with people, instead of just believing whoever sounded the most confident or had the most credentials. I asked if he really thought he could change that pattern because it seemed pretty deeply rooted. He said he didn't know, but he wanted to try if I was willing to give him the chance. I told him I needed more time to think about whether I could trust him again after this. Whether knowing he'd been so easily convinced I was incompetent was something I could get past. We left the coffee shop without making any decisions about our future. That week, I kept thinking about everything and realized I needed outside perspective from someone who understood the professional side of what I'd done. I emailed Julian Lozano, my former professor from grad school who I'd stayed in touch with. I explained the whole situation, how I'd found Melissa's plagiarism while reviewing her work for Dr. Harrison, and asked about the ethics of it all. Julian called me the next day instead of emailing back. He listened to the full story and then said something that surprised me. He pointed out that exposing academic fraud was actually an ethical obligation for anyone who discovered it. That regardless of my personal reasons for looking closely at Melissa's work, finding and reporting plagiarism was the right thing to do. He said the academic system relied on people being honest about these things. If I'd found the fraud and not reported it, that would have been the ethical problem. My motivations for reviewing her research in the first place didn't change the fact that what I'd found was real and needed to be addressed. Talking to Julian helped me feel less guilty about the whole thing. 2 weeks after Nathan moved his stuff out, I got an email that made my stomach drop. It was from Melissa. The subject line just said, "I know it was you." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won out. Her email wasn't angry like I'd expected. Instead, it was kind of defeated and sad. She'd figured out my connection to Dr. Harrison somehow, probably by going through his correspondence after everything fell apart. She wrote that she understood now that I'd been the one who reviewed her work and found all the problems. But then she said something that surprised me. She acknowledged the plagiarism was real, that she'd convinced herself the similarities to those Russian papers were just coincidental, because the ideas seemed obvious to her. But when faced with all 17 instances laid out together, she couldn't deny it anymore. She said she'd gotten lazy and sloppy, taking shortcuts because she was behind on her research timeline. She knew it was wrong, but had convinced herself it wasn't that bad. The email ended with her saying she didn't blame me for reporting it because it was the truth. I read that email 3 times trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me had expected her to be furious and accusatory. This acceptance and acknowledgement of her own fraud was somehow harder to process. I didn't respond to Melissa's email, but I did forward it to Nathan. He needed to see that his friend had been both a fraud and someone who deliberately tried to destroy our relationship. He called me within 10 minutes of me sending it, his voice shaking. He kept apologizing again, saying he finally understood the full picture of what had happened, that Melissa had manipulated him while being academically dishonest the whole time. He said he felt stupid for not seeing it earlier, for believing her over me. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I still didn't know what it meant for us. We talked for another hour about everything that had happened. By the end of the call, Nathan asked if I'd be willing to try couples counseling. He said he recognized we had serious trust and communication problems that he couldn't fix on his own. That if there was any chance of saving our relationship, we needed professional help to work through it. I was surprised he suggested it because Nathan had always been kind of skeptical about therapy, but I agreed to try it because I still wasn't ready to completely give up on us. We started seeing a therapist the following week. The first session was awkward and uncomfortable, both of us sitting on opposite ends of this beige couch trying to explain what had brought us there. The therapist asked a lot of questions about our relationship history and the specific incidents with Melissa. Over the next few sessions, she helped us identify patterns we'd both missed. She pointed out that Nathan's insecurity about his education and career had led him to undervalue practical expertise while overvaluing theoretical knowledge and academic credentials. That dynamic had made our relationship vulnerable to someone like Melissa, who presented herself as intellectually superior. The therapist also made me look at my own behavior, how I'd chosen revenge instead of just confronting the problem directly, how I'd played into Melissa's perception of me as less intelligent instead of standing up for myself earlier. She said we both had work to do on communication and trust if we wanted to rebuild anything real. Nathan started working on his insecurity issues and learning to value different kinds of intelligence and expertise. I worked on being more direct about my feelings instead of letting resentment build up until I did something destructive. It was slow progress, and some sessions were really hard, with both of us getting defensive or upset. But gradually, things started feeling a little better between us. 3 months passed, and things with Nathan got better, but different. We talked more about what we were feeling instead of just assuming we understood each other. When I felt hurt by something he said, I told him right away instead of letting it build up. When he felt insecure about his work or our relationship, he actually said so instead of taking it out on me in weird, indirect ways. But there was this new carefulness between us that hadn't been there before. Like we were both watching for signs that the other person might doubt us again. I caught myself sometimes waiting to see if he'd question my judgment on something, and I could tell he was doing the same thing, watching to see if I was angry or planning something. It wasn't bad exactly, just different from the easy trust we used to have. We were building something more honest, but it took more work and attention than before. Then my boss called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. I thought maybe I'd made some mistake on the satellite component testing, but instead she told me they were promoting me to senior engineer. The position came with a significant raise and my own team to lead on the next generation navigation systems project. I sat there kind of stunned because I'd been so focused on the situation with Nathan and Melissa that I hadn't even realized the promotion cycle was happening. My boss said the decision was easy because my published research and technical contributions over the past year had been outstanding. I thanked her and walked back to my desk feeling this weird mix of pride and relief. That night, I told Nathan about the promotion, and he immediately pulled me into a hug and said he was so proud of me. He insisted on throwing me a celebration dinner that weekend and invited a bunch of our friends and some of his coworkers. At the dinner, he kept telling people about my research papers and technical expertise without me even bringing it up. He'd mention specific projects I'd worked on and explain why they were important. It felt like a test we were both passing, him showing he valued my work, and me letting him celebrate my success without wondering if he had ulterior motives. A few weeks after that, Kara pulled me aside at work during lunch. She had this uncomfortable look on her face and said she'd heard something through academic networks about Melissa. Apparently, she'd left the PhD program completely, not just taking time off but actually withdrawing. She'd moved back to her hometown somewhere in Ohio to work in her family's business, something to do with commercial real estate. Kara said she thought I should know since the whole situation had been so messy. I felt this complicated knot in my stomach hearing that news. Part of me felt satisfied that Melissa had faced real consequences for her fraud and for trying to destroy my relationship. She'd been exposed as a fake and lost the career she'd been so smug about. But another part of me felt uncomfortable with how completely her life had fallen apart. I'd exposed real plagiarism and bad research. That was true. But I'd also done it specifically to hurt her because of what she'd done to me. The severity of her fall, losing everything she'd worked toward and having to leave academia entirely, felt heavier than I'd expected it to feel. I thanked Kara for telling me and went back to work, but I kept thinking about it for days after. Nathan and I talked about Melissa's situation that weekend. I told him what Kara had said and admitted I felt weird about it. He said he understood why I'd done what I did, and that Melissa had brought the consequences on herself through her own dishonesty. But he also said he knew I probably felt conflicted about being the one who'd triggered everything. We decided to keep working on our relationship, to stay together and keep going to therapy and building something more honest than what we'd had before. Both of us had changed because of what happened. I knew now that I was capable of calculated revenge, of planning and executing someone's downfall in a really deliberate way, and that was uncomfortable knowledge to have about myself. Nathan knew he was capable of betraying someone he loved, Not through deliberate cruelty, but through weakness and insecurity, and letting someone else manipulate his perceptions. We were building something more real than the easy rhythm we used to share. It was harder work and less comfortable, but it felt more solid somehow, like we actually knew who we were now and were choosing each other anyway, despite our flaws and capacity for hurting each other. The wariness was still there, but so was something deeper. A commitment to being honest even when it was difficult and trusting each other even though we both knew trust could be broken. After buying a new home, a police officer asked me, "Are you aware there's a body decomposing in your walls?" "What? Don't think I had anything to do with this. I called you guys because of the smell." I crossed my arms defensively. The officer's face stayed neutral, but his partner was already walking toward their patrol car. "Due to the nature of your relationship to the victim, we're going to have to bring you in for questioning." "Relationship to the victim? Who's the victim?" My voice cracked with confusion. "We're not at liberty to say at this time. Please come with us." He gestured toward the car. I'd bought this house just 3 weeks ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start after my divorce. A little 2-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood where I could rebuild my life. The smell had started a few days after I moved in. At first I thought it was a dead mouse in the walls. Then it got worse. Sweet and rotting and impossible to ignore. The officer guided me to the back seat of the patrol car. No handcuffs, but the door locks clicked with finality. Through the window, I watched more police arrive. Crime scene tape went up around my new home. Officers in white hazmat suits carried equipment inside. This was really happening. During the ride to the station, my mind raced through possibilities. The previous owner had been an elderly woman who'd died in a nursing home. Her family had sold the house quickly. Maybe someone had broken in while it sat empty. Maybe there'd been a murder years ago that nobody knew about. But why did they think I had a relationship with whoever was in my walls? At the station, they put me in a small interrogation room. Gray walls and a metal table with one of those big mirrors everyone knows is one-way glass. I sat there for what felt like hours. No phone call, no lawyer, just me and my panicked thoughts. Through the door I could hear muffled voices. Officers walking past in the hallway. Phones ringing. Normal police station sounds that felt surreal given my situation. I'd never been in trouble with the law. Never even gotten a speeding ticket. Now I was being questioned about a dead body in my house. 2 officers finally entered the room. Detective Harper was older with gray hair and tired eyes. Detective McGuire looked younger and kept glancing at a file folder. They sat across from me, and the older one started a recording device. "I want to be clear that I just bought this house. Whatever's in those walls has nothing to do with me." I said it before they could speak. Harper nodded but didn't look convinced. "We'll get to that. First, can you tell us about your family?" "My family? I'm divorced. No kids. My parents live in Florida." I didn't understand the question. "What about siblings?" McGuire asked while taking notes. My stomach tightened. "I had a brother. He went missing 15 years ago." The detectives exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. Harper opened the file folder and pulled out a photo. It was a forensic photo of something wrapped in plastic inside a wall cavity. I couldn't make out details, but the shape was obviously human. "Your brother was 17 when he disappeared, correct?" Harper's voice was gentle but firm. "Yes. We filed a missing person report. The police never found anything." My hands were shaking now. "And you were living where at the time?" McGuire leaned forward. "With my parents. About 10 miles from here." My mouth felt dry. They asked more questions about my brother. When I'd last seen him. What he was wearing. If we'd fought before he vanished. Each question felt like a trap, but I answered honestly. Tommy had been troubled. Drugs and bad friends. We'd all assumed he'd run away. After an hour of questions, Harper finally got to the point. "The thing is, we found some interesting evidence in those walls along with the body." "What kind of evidence?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "DNA evidence. Hair. Blood. Things that help us identify not just the victim, but potentially who put them there." His eyes never left mine. I waited for him to continue. The room felt smaller. The air thicker. McGuire was still writing notes, but I could feel him watching me too. Whatever they'd found, it was bad. Bad enough that they'd brought me in immediately. Bad enough that they thought I was involved. Harper stood up and walked around the table. He placed another photo in front of me. This one showed a gold-class ring covered in dirt and decay. Tommy's high school ring. The one he'd never taken off. The one we'd assumed he was wearing when he disappeared. "We're rushing the DNA tests, but initial field tests are concerning." Harper's voice dropped lower. "Concerning how?" I managed to ask. He sat on the edge of the table looking down at me. McGuire had stopped writing. The recorder's red light blinked steadily. "Ma'am, why is it that we found your son's DNA in your walls?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I actually jerked back in my chair. My mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "I don't have a son." The detectives looked at each other and then back at me. "I've never had kids." My voice cracked on the last word. Harper leaned back in his chair and studied my face for what felt like forever. His fingers drummed on the table once, twice, 3 times. "The field test shows first-degree relative DNA." His voice was slow and careful, like he was talking to a child. "That means parent, child, or sibling." McGuire kept writing in his notebook. "We're waiting on more detailed lab work, but someone closely related to you was in those walls." My hands were shaking, so hard I had to press them flat against the cold metal table. "I want a lawyer." The words came out louder than I meant them to. "I want a lawyer right now." Harper reached over and clicked off the recording device. The red light went dark. They both stood up at the same time. "We'll give you some time to think about that." Harper's voice was flat. They left me alone in that gray room again. I stared at my reflection in the one-way mirror. My face looked pale and strange. Could Tommy have had a kid nobody knew about? He was only 17 when he disappeared, but he'd been running with a rough crowd. Dating girls our parents didn't approve of. Maybe one of them got pregnant. Maybe that's why he ran away. Or maybe the test was wrong. Maybe they were just trying to scare me into confessing something. The door opened again after what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes according to the clock on the wall. Harper came in alone this time. He set my phone and wallet on the table. "You're free to go for now." He pulled out a business card and placed it next to my things. "Don't leave town. We'll be in touch soon." I grabbed my stuff and stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. My legs felt weak as I walked toward the door. Harper called after me. "Ma'am, you might want to think real hard about what your brother was up to before he went missing." The hallway outside the interrogation room was bright after being in that dim space for so long. Other officers walked past without looking at me. A drunk guy was arguing with someone at the front desk. Normal police station chaos that had nothing to do with dead bodies and walls. I pushed through the heavy front doors and the cold air hit my face. My car was still in the parking lot where I'd left it. The key fob shook in my hand as I unlocked it. I sat in the driver's seat and immediately pulled out my phone. Mom's number rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Mom, it's me." My voice was shaking. "They found something in my house. They think it might be Tommy. Call me back as soon as you get this. Please." I sat there for another minute trying to think. Then I scrolled through my contacts until I found my ex-husband's number. We hadn't talked since the divorce papers were signed 6 months ago. The phone rang twice. "Hello?" His voice sounded confused. "It's me." I took a deep breath. "I need help. The police just questioned me about a body in my house." There was silence for a moment. "What?" "I bought this house 3 weeks ago and there was a smell and I called the cops and they found someone in the walls and they think I knew about it." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Slow down." His voice had that calm tone he used during our worst fights. "Are you under arrest?" "No. They let me go but said not to leave town. You need a lawyer immediately." Papers rustled in the background. "I know someone. Georgia Ayers. She's good. I'll text you her number." "Thank you." The conversation felt weird after everything we'd been through. I know things ended badly between us, but I didn't know who else to call. "It's okay. Just get the lawyer and don't talk to the police again without her." He paused. "And maybe stay somewhere else tonight. Not that house." We hung up and his text came through 30 seconds later. I saved the number and started my car. The drive to my apartment took 20 minutes but felt longer. Every cop car I passed made my heart race. I kept checking my mirrors like someone might be following me. My apartment was a cheap 1-bedroom I'd rented after the divorce. Most of my stuff was still in boxes since I'd been planning to move everything to the house. Now that house was a crime scene. I spent the rest of the day going through old boxes looking for anything about Tommy. His senior year yearbook was in a box marked family stuff, along with some old photo albums. There he was at 17. Dark hair that was always too long. That crooked smile he'd flash when he was up to something. The same gold class ring the police had shown me. Pictures of him at family dinners. At the beach during our last vacation together. Him and Dad working on a car in the garage. Nothing that explained how he ended up inside a wall. The next morning I called Georgia Ayers first thing. Her assistant scheduled me for 10 o'clock. The law office was downtown in one of those old buildings with marble floors and wood paneling. Why would they think she has a son when she's clearly never had kids? Something feels off about how quickly they connected this body to her family, especially since she just bought this house 3 weeks ago. Georgia herself was maybe 50 with short gray hair and sharp eyes behind designer glasses. She listened while I explained everything from buying the house to the interrogation. She took notes on a yellow legal pad, asked questions about dates and times, made me go through the whole thing twice. First rule. She looked at me over her glasses. "Don't talk to police again without me present. Ever." I nodded. Second rule. Document everything. Every call, every interaction. Save it all. She wrote something else on her pad. "Now about this DNA evidence." She tapped her pen on the desk. "Police sometimes use misleading language during interrogations to get reactions." She leaned forward. "First-degree relative could mean your brother, not necessarily a son." She explained how basic field tests can't always distinguish between different types of family relationships. "Let's wait for the actual lab results before jumping to conclusions." My phone buzzed while she was talking. A text from Detective Harper. "They're executing a search warrant at my house right now." I showed her the screen. Georgia immediately picked up her desk phone and dialed a number. "Detective Harper? This is Georgia Ayers. I represent the homeowner." She listened for a moment. "I expect full compliance with the warrant's scope. Nothing beyond what's specified." Another pause. "Yes, I'll be requesting copies of everything." She hung up and looked at me. "They're going to tear that house apart looking for evidence." She stood up and walked to her window. "The good news is you just bought it. Hard to argue you hid something there 15 years ago when you didn't own it." She turned back to me. "But we need to figure out the connection. Why that house? Why now?" I thought about the elderly woman who'd owned it before. Her family selling it quickly. The construction company my dad had worked for. All these pieces that didn't quite fit together yet. I don't know. I rubbed my temples where a headache was starting. But I'm going to find out. George's assistant knocked on the door and said my mother was calling my cell, which I'd left with the receptionist. I grabbed the phone and stepped into the hallway while Georgia made more notes. Mom's voice sounded weird, like she was trying to sound normal but failing. "Don't say anything to the police without a lawyer," she said fast. I asked what she knew about Tommy, and she went quiet for a few seconds before saying she needed to talk to Dad first. The call ended before I could push harder. Back in Georgia's office, she was already on her phone arranging for someone named Aditya Maxwell to come in. He showed up an hour later carrying a laptop bag and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Georgia explained he was a forensic consultant who could help us understand the DNA stuff. Aditya pulled out charts and started explaining how field tests work versus full lab panels. "Parent-child and sibling relationships can look similar in basic tests," he said while pointing at some graph. The technical details went over my head, but the main point was clear. The cops might have jumped to conclusions, We couldn't know for sure until the full lab work came back. My phone started buzzing nonstop while Aditya was talking. I checked it and saw dozens of texts and missed calls. The local news had broken the story about the body in my house, and they were calling me a person of interest. My boss had texted asking what was going on. Friends from high school were messaging on Facebook. My ex-husband had sent 3 texts asking if I was okay. The story was everywhere already. Georgia told me not to respond to anyone and definitely not to post anything on social media. She made copies of all the messages for our records. The next day, Georgia called me back to her office. She'd gotten the search warrant returns and spread papers across her conference table. Old renovation permits from 15 years ago showed work done on my house. The construction company name made my stomach drop. It was the same company Dad had worked for back then. I remembered him doing side jobs on weekends for extra cash right around when Tommy disappeared. Georgia saw my face and asked what was wrong. I explained about Dad's job, and she started making more notes. I called Mom again from Georgia's office with the lawyer listening on speaker. I asked about Dad working on that specific house, and she got defensive immediately. She said lots of houses had work done by that company and I was being paranoid, but her voice shook when she said it. She hung up claiming she had a doctor's appointment. Aditya came back 2 days later with updates on the DNA analysis. He had printouts showing different markers and explained that telling the difference between father and son needed more specific testing. The field test can't tell that difference yet. We need to wait for the full panel. The science made sense, but waiting was killing me. I tried calling Dad directly that evening. He answered on the 3rd ring and sounded annoyed from the start. When I mentioned the house and the permits, he got angry. "Let the past stay buried," he said, and those exact words made me feel sick. Georgia had told me to document everything, so I wrote down the whole conversation word for word after he hung up on me. Detective Harper called Georgia's office the next morning wanting me to come in for a DNA swab to help exclude me from the investigation. Georgia took the phone from me immediately. "They can get a warrant if they need it," she told him before hanging up. She explained they were fishing and we weren't going to make it easy for them. That night I couldn't sleep and started going through more boxes in my apartment. I found my old diary from when I was 17, right when Tommy disappeared. Reading it brought everything back. Page after page talked about Dad and Tommy fighting all the time before he vanished. There were entries about arguments where Tommy kept yelling about telling the truth, but teenage me hadn't understood what they meant. I'd written about being scared and confused and just wanting everyone to stop fighting. One entry mentioned Dad coming home late with dirt on his clothes the night Tommy left. I'd forgotten that detail completely until reading it again. The diary went to Georgia's office the next morning. She photocopied every page and locked the original in her safe. 3 days later, Georgia got a call from someone named Alyssa Morales, who was part of the family that had sold me the house. She wanted to talk, but only through lawyers. We set up a conference call that afternoon. Alyssa's voice was nervous, but she had important information. The house had smell problems multiple times over the years, and her grandmother had paid for wall patches several times. She remembered a handyman named Al who did a lot of work there. The way she described him sounded exactly like my dad. Same height, same hair color back then, same way of talking. Georgia asked for any receipts or records, but Alyssa said her grandmother had thrown most stuff away. She did have some old photos from family gatherings where the handyman might be in the background. Georgia arranged to get copies of everything. After the call, Georgia looked at me seriously and said we needed to prepare for the possibility that Dad was involved somehow. The timeline was too perfect to be coincidence. Tommy disappearing, Dad doing work on that exact house, the body ending up in those walls. Everything pointed in one direction, even if we didn't have proof yet. Georgia picked up her phone right then and started typing out formal records requests for every construction permit filed in that area 15 years ago. Her fingers moved fast across the screen while she talked about building our own timeline of what really happened. I watched her work and felt my stomach getting tighter because I knew what we might find about my family. She sent off 3 different requests to the county records office and the building department, and even the old construction company's archived files if they still existed. The waiting was going to kill me, but Georgia said these things take time and we had to be patient. 2 days later, Harper called Georgia's office with news from the lab that made everything worse. The DNA was definitely from a male first-degree relative, which meant either father, son, or brother. The local news station got hold of this somehow and ran a story about me having a secret son that nobody knew about. I wanted to throw my TV out the window when I saw them speculating about some hidden pregnancy from when I was 17. Georgia had to calm me down and remind me that the media always gets things wrong. Harper wanted to discuss the narrowing evidence, but Georgia told him we weren't talking without something concrete. That night, I couldn't take it anymore and decided I was driving to Florida no matter what Georgia said about staying put. I packed a bag and got in my car at 5 in the morning for the 12-hour drive south. The whole drive, I practiced what I was going to say to my parents about Tommy and the house and everything that was happening. I stopped for gas 3 times, and each time I almost turned around but kept going because I needed answers. My phone rang around noon, and it was my ex-husband leaving a voicemail since I didn't answer. He said he was worried about me after seeing the news, but he was keeping his distance because this wasn't his problem to deal with. Part of me wished he was there for support, but I understood why he stayed away. I pulled into my parents' condo complex in the evening, just as the sun was setting behind the palm trees. Mom answered the door looking exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and her hair not even brushed. Dad was sitting in his old brown recliner watching the news and barely looked up when I walked in. The tension in the room was so thick I could barely breathe. I sat down on their couch and jumped right into asking about the house and Tommy and what really happened back then. Dad's face got red immediately, and he snapped that he'd worked on hundreds of houses during those years. Mom kept trying to change the subject to dinner or asking about my drive, but I wouldn't let her distract me. I kept pushing and asking specific questions about that exact house and the dates when Tommy disappeared. Dad got up from his chair and went to the garage saying he needed to check something. I followed him, and that's when I saw his old tool belt hanging on a hook with a faded company tag that matched the permit records Georgia had found. When I pointed at it and asked him to explain, He claimed it didn't mean anything and lots of workers had those belts. But his hands were shaking when he said it, and he wouldn't look me in the eye. My phone buzzed with a call from Aditya, who had an update about the DNA markers they were testing. He explained that newer tests were suggesting father rather than son was more likely based on specific genetic patterns. He told me to be patient for the final results, but my stomach was churning as I looked at my father across the garage. I went back inside and the conversation got more heated with Dad yelling that I should leave the past alone. Mom was crying and begging both of us to stop fighting, but I couldn't let it go now. Then Dad suddenly stood up and said something that changed everything. "I did what I had to do to protect this family," he said, and the words hung in the air like poison. Mom started sobbing harder and begging me to leave it alone and think about what this would do to our family. Dad's face was stone cold and he stared at me like he was daring me to push further. My phone lit up with a text from Georgia telling me urgently to leave immediately and not to get any more statements without recording equipment. She said anything he said now couldn't be used without proper documentation, and I was putting myself at risk. I grabbed my bag and started walking toward the door with my whole body shaking from what had just happened. Dad called after me to think about my mother and what this would do to her, but I kept walking. I got in my car and drove to the nearest motel where I sat on the bed trying to process what had just happened. Dad had basically admitted something without actually saying the words, and Mom knew whatever it was. The motel room smelled like old cigarettes, and the air conditioner rattled, but I couldn't go back to their condo. I called Georgia and told her everything that happened, and she said we needed to be very careful going forward. She was already working on getting proper recording equipment and preparing for what might come next. I spent that night staring at the ceiling and thinking about Tommy and how he ended up in those walls. Everything pointed to Dad being involved, but I still couldn't understand how my own father could do something like this. The motel bed creaked when I sat up, and something about the old springs made me remember our house back when I was 17. Tommy had come home late one night and Dad was waiting in the kitchen. I could hear them yelling from my room, and Tommy kept saying he was going to tell everyone about what Dad did. Dad grabbed him by the shirt and shoved him against the wall. The memory hit me so hard I had to run to the bathroom and throw up. I'd blocked that fight out completely until now. My phone buzzed with a news alert and my hands shook as I read it. Police were seeking a warrant for my father's DNA based on new evidence in the case. Georgia called right after and her voice was all business. She told me things were moving fast now and to be ready for what was coming. I turned on the TV and every local channel was covering the story. A reporter had somehow gotten an interview with Alyssa and she was talking about the house repairs. She mentioned specific dates when contractors had patched the drywall and fixed the walls. The dates matched exactly with when Tommy disappeared. I felt cold even though the Florida sun was blazing through the motel window. My phone rang again and it was Mom telling me Dad had hired his own lawyer. She said he'd agreed to give his DNA sample under the warrant instead of fighting it. Georgia texted me that this was legally smart, but it meant Dad knew what they would find. The waiting was going to kill me. I couldn't stay in Florida another second, so I packed my bag and started the long drive home. The highway stretched forever, and I kept thinking about Tommy sealed up in those walls. Every mile made my chest tighter. When I finally got back to town, I drove straight to the house even though I knew I couldn't go inside. Crime tape wrapped around the whole property like a yellow spider web. I parked across the street and stared at my house that wasn't really mine anymore. How did my brother end up behind that drywall? 3 days passed, and each one felt like a year. I stayed in my apartment and jumped every time my phone rang. Georgia checked in twice a day, but there was nothing to report yet. Then Harper called Georgia with the results. The DNA from the walls matched my father perfectly. Not Tommy and not some imaginary son, but my actual father. The relief that it wasn't some unknown child mixed with horror about what Dad had done. Georgia said the police were moving to arrest him immediately. They got Dad at his condo in Florida the next morning. The charges were abuse of a corpse and tampering with evidence. They couldn't prove murder since the cause of death was unclear after 15 years in the walls. Mom called me sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. She kept saying this couldn't be happening and that Dad was a good man. I didn't know what to say to her. The jail let Dad make phone calls and of course he called me. His voice was hard and cold when he told me I needed to tell police I didn't remember anything from back then. He said family sticks together and I owed him that much. I hung up on him and blocked the number. My hands were shaking with rage. Mom called an hour later and this time she wasn't crying. Her voice was flat and empty when she finally told me the truth. Tommy had overdosed at home one night when I was at a sleepover. Dad found him in his room already gone. Instead of calling 911 like any normal person would do, Dad panicked about the scandal. He didn't want people knowing his son was a drug user. Mom had begged him to call for help, but Dad said it was too late anyway. She explained how Dad had been doing renovation work on that exact house for extra cash back then. The elderly owner had gone to visit family for a week and Dad had the keys. He wrapped Tommy in plastic and took him there in the middle of the night. Dad opened up the wall he was supposed to be fixing anyway and put Tommy inside. Then he sealed it all up with new drywall and painted over it like nothing happened. Mom had watched him leave with Tommy's body and come back hours later covered in drywall dust. She'd kept this secret for 15 years. The practical details made me run to the bathroom again. My father had treated my brother like construction waste. He'd sealed him up and painted over him. All those years we'd wondered where Tommy went and Mom knew he was in those walls. Every Christmas when we'd light a candle for Tommy and hope he was okay somewhere. Every birthday that passed without him. Every time Dad acted sad about his missing son. They both knew exactly where he was the whole time. I sat on my bathroom floor and cried until I couldn't breathe. Everything about my family was a lie. The people who were supposed to protect us had hidden my brother in a wall to avoid embarrassment. They'd let me grow up thinking he'd run away when really he was sealed up 10 miles from our house. And the worst part was that I'd bought that exact house by pure chance and uncovered their secret myself. Georgia called the next morning and told me to come to her office right away. I drove there still feeling sick from everything Mom had told me. Georgia had already started working on a statement for the police that showed I was only 15 when Tommy disappeared. She pulled out old school records and work schedules that proved I couldn't have been involved. We spent 3 hours going through every detail from that time period. Georgia typed everything up in a clear timeline that showed exactly where I was when it happened. She called Harper and set up a meeting for that afternoon to present our evidence. I signed the statement with shaking hands. Georgia squeezed my shoulder and promised this would help clear my name. 2 days later, the HOA president left a voicemail about an emergency meeting. The whole neighborhood wanted to discuss the murder house situation. I didn't want to go, but Georgia said it might help to show my face. The meeting was in the community center and the room was packed. People turned to stare when I walked in. Most of them looked angry or scared. The HOA president talked about property values and safety concerns. One man stood up and said I should move out immediately. A woman near the back said having a murder house would ruin the whole neighborhood. Then an older woman stood up and said she understood I was a victim too. She pointed out that I'd just found out my brother was murdered by my own father. A few people nodded, but most still looked hostile. The meeting went on for 2 hours with people arguing about what to do. I left feeling worse than when I'd arrived. The next morning, Harper called Georgia to schedule another interview. This time he was different when we sat down in the interview room. He asked about our family dynamics growing up and actually listened to my answers. I told him about Dad's temper and how he cared more about appearances than anything else. McGuire took notes about the timeline and asked follow-up questions that weren't accusatory. Harper said the evidence was clearly pointing to my father as the only person involved. The interview only lasted an hour, and Harper shook my hand when we left. Georgia said this was a good sign for how things were going. Aditya called that afternoon with his final DNA report. The results were definitive that the DNA from the walls was my father's, not some imaginary son. He explained the science in simple terms that even I could understand. The report showed exact matches on multiple markers that proved it beyond any doubt. Georgia immediately sent the report to every news outlet that had been running the crazy son theory. She also posted it on social media to counter all the wild speculation. Within hours, the narrative started shifting from me being a suspect to being a victim. People online started expressing sympathy instead of suspicion. The next day, the district attorney's office announced the charges against Dad. They were charging him with tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. Murder charges weren't possible since they couldn't prove how Tommy died after all this time. It felt like he was getting away with something, but Georgia explained this was realistic. She said proving murder without a clear cause of death was nearly impossible. Mom called crying again and said she was standing by Dad no matter what. I couldn't understand how she could support him after what he'd done. She kept saying he was still her husband and she'd taken vows. 3 days later, the contractors were ready to properly remove Tommy from the walls. The medical examiner said family could be present if we wanted. I didn't want to go, but felt like I owed it to Tommy. The smell hit me as soon as I walked into the house. Workers in white suits carefully opened the wall section by section. They photographed everything and took measurements. Then they gently lifted out the plastic-wrapped form. My legs felt weak watching them carry my brother out after 15 years. Tommy deserved to be treated with dignity, and I was there to make sure he got it. The medical examiner took him for a proper examination and eventual release for burial. We scheduled a small memorial service for the following week. Only a few of Mom and Dad's old friends came. Dad was obviously absent since he was still in jail. Mom sat in the front row but barely spoke to anyone. The service was awkward with people not knowing what to say. The pastor talked about forgiveness and healing, but it felt hollow. We buried Tommy next to our grandparents in the family plot. Mom left immediately after without saying goodbye. I stayed and talked to Tommy's grave for a while. Alyssa contacted me through Georgia about meeting to discuss the house. We met at a coffee shop since I couldn't go back to the house yet. She was professional but clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. She brought estimates from contractors for the repair work. The walls would need complete reconstruction in that section. New insulation and drywall would cost thousands of dollars. She also explained the disclosure requirements for the house going forward. Any future sale would require telling buyers about the death. We worked out a payment plan for the repairs. I also met with a real estate attorney that Georgia recommended. He explained that the death disclosure would destroy the property value. Houses where murders or deaths occurred typically sold for 30% less. The financial hit on top of everything else made me want to scream. I'd already spent my savings on the down payment and now this. The attorney said I could try to recoup losses from the seller, but it was unlikely. I started budgeting every penny to figure out how to pay for everything. Georgia decided to file a civil claim against the seller's estate anyway. She said they should have known about the body during all those years of repairs. The smell complaints and repeated patch jobs were red flags they ignored. The claim probably wouldn't succeed, but she said it was worth trying. At least I was taking some kind of action instead of just accepting everything. 2 weeks later, Georgia called to tell me Dad decided to plead guilty to the charges. The prosecutor had offered a deal for tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse if he admitted what he'd done. Georgia explained this meant I wouldn't have to testify at trial, which was a huge relief since I'd been dreading that for weeks. The sentencing hearing got scheduled for next month, and she warned me Mom would probably be there supporting him. I hung up feeling both relieved and angry that he was taking the easy way out, instead of facing what he'd really done to Tommy. The next morning, I got a call from Mom saying she was selling their condo and moving to a smaller apartment near the prison where Dad would serve his time. She said she forgave me for turning against the family, but her voice was cold and distant. We started talking maybe once a week after that, but only about safe topics like the weather or her new apartment, never about Dad or Tommy or anything real. I couldn't understand how she could stand by him after everything, but arguing about it just made things worse between us. After thinking about it for days, I decided to keep the house instead of taking a huge loss trying to sell it with the death disclosure requirements. The contractor Georgia recommended came by with his crew, and they were respectful about the whole situation, not asking questions or making me feel weird about what happened there. They tore out the damaged walls completely and rebuilt that whole section with new insulation and drywall. Over the next few weeks, the place slowly stopped feeling like a crime scene and started feeling like it could actually be a home again. Georgia gave me the name of a therapist who specialized in family trauma, and I made an appointment even though I wasn't sure talking would help. The first session was harder than I expected, and I cried through most of it, but when I left, I felt lighter somehow, like maybe I could actually work through all this mess. The therapist was patient and didn't push too hard, just let me talk about Tommy and Dad and everything that had happened at my own pace. We scheduled weekly appointments, and I found myself actually looking forward to having someone neutral to talk to about everything. Georgia asked if I wanted to write a victim impact statement for Dad's sentencing hearing to explain how his choices had affected our whole family. I spent 3 nights working on it, writing and rewriting to get the words right about losing Tommy twice. First when he disappeared, and again when I learned Dad had hidden him. The statement talked about the years of not knowing, the false hope every time the phone rang, and the betrayal of learning Dad had let us suffer when he knew the truth all along. Georgia read it and said it was powerful and would definitely make an impact on the judge at sentencing. A few days later, I was carrying groceries in when my neighbor from 2 houses down walked over with a plate of cookies. She said she was sorry about how the HOA meeting had gone, and that not everyone felt that way about me living there. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than she probably knew after weeks of people avoiding eye contact or crossing the street when they saw me coming. The cookies were good too, chocolate chip and still warm, and we actually talked for a few minutes about normal things like her garden and the weather getting cooler. The court finally released Tommy's personal effects to me, including his class ring that they'd found with his body. I held it in my hands for a long time, remembering how proud he'd been when he got it, and how he never took it off even to shower. I couldn't bring myself to wear it, but I bought a small wooden memory box and placed it inside, along with some photos and other things that reminded me of him before everything went bad. Some things were just too heavy to carry around every day, but I wanted to keep them safe. The house renovations finished after 6 weeks, and the smell of fresh paint had completely replaced that awful sweet rot that had started everything. It wasn't perfect, and I'd always know what had been in those walls, but it was livable, and even starting to feel like mine. I bought new furniture for the living room and bedroom. Nothing fancy, but different enough that it didn't feel like I was living in someone else's space anymore. The contractor had done good work, and you couldn't even tell where the wall had been opened up, unless you knew exactly where to look. I spent an entire evening writing Dad a letter setting clear boundaries about our relationship going forward. I told him there would be no contact between us until he took real responsibility for what he'd done, not just the legal plea, but actually admitting he'd chosen to hide Tommy and let us all suffer. I didn't expect a response and didn't get one, but Mom called a few days later saying he was angry about my letter and felt I was being unfair. I told her I didn't care about his feelings anymore, and she hung up on me. The next Saturday morning, I drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers for Tommy's grave. I sat on the grass and told him everything that had happened since we'd found him. About Dad going to prison and Mom choosing him over us. About the house getting fixed up and my therapy sessions. It felt good to talk to him, even though I knew he couldn't answer. Just having a place to visit and leave flowers made it feel like he was finally at peace. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful with big oak trees providing shade, and I stayed for over an hour just sitting with him. The weeks turned into months, and I found myself getting into a real routine with therapy every Thursday at 4, and work keeping me busy enough not to think too much about everything. She kept a box of tissues on the side table, but I needed them less and less as time went on. The nightmares about finding Tommy got better too, down from every night to maybe once a week. Work helped because my coworkers knew the basics, but didn't treat me like I was made of glass or about to break at any moment. My boss even pulled me aside one day to tell me she was impressed with how I was handling everything, and that my performance reviews were still strong. Dad's sentencing happened on a cold Tuesday morning, and the judge gave him 3 years for tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. Mom sat behind him in the courtroom wearing her good church dress, and I sat on the other side with Georgia, who squeezed my hand when they led Dad away in handcuffs. 3 years felt like both forever, and not nearly enough for what he'd done to our family. Mom started visiting him every Saturday morning at the prison 2 hours away, and we worked out this unspoken agreement where she didn't tell me about the visits, and I didn't ask. Our phone calls got shorter and more about safe topics like the weather or her book club. The boundaries made it easier somehow. The house started feeling more like mine after all the repairs were done and the real estate market calmed down enough that I wasn't completely underwater on the mortgage anymore. I painted the living room a soft blue color and bought new curtains that actually matched. My best friend Sarah finally came to visit after months of me telling her it was okay, and we sat on my new couch drinking wine while she looked around at everything I'd done to make the place comfortable. She told me she was proud of how I'd handled all the crap that had happened, and we actually laughed about normal stuff like her terrible date the week before. It felt good to laugh about something stupid instead of crying about something awful. I met someone new at a coffee shop near work when he accidentally grabbed my drink order and we got talking while waiting for them to remake both our coffees. His name was Mark, and when I eventually told him the whole story about Tommy and the house and Dad, he didn't run away or look at me like I was damaged goods. We took things really slow with lunch dates and walks in the park, and he never pushed for more than I was ready to give. He had this patient way of listening without trying to fix everything or tell me how I should feel about it all. Almost a year after we buried Tommy properly, we held a memorial service at the cemetery, and more people showed up than I expected. Some of his old high school friends came and shared stories about him from before things got bad, like the time he helped them build a skateboard ramp, or when he taught one kid how to play guitar. We put fresh flowers on his grave, and someone brought a portable speaker to play some of his favorite songs from back then. It felt more like celebrating who he was instead of mourning what happened to him, which I think he would have liked better anyway. Dad sent a letter from prison asking for my forgiveness and saying he was sorry for everything he'd put the family through, but I wasn't ready to write back and didn't know if I ever would be. My therapist said that was perfectly fine, and that forgiveness was something I got to decide on my own timeline or not at all if that's what felt right. She helped me understand that some things don't get neat endings with everyone hugging and making up like in movies. The promotion at work came through after my annual review, and with the raise, I could finally afford to take that trip to Italy I'd been dreaming about since college. I spent 10 days eating pasta and walking through museums, and not thinking about dead brothers or prison visits or houses with bodies in the walls. The vacation felt like breathing fresh air after being underground for too long, and I came back with a tan and actual energy instead of just going through the motions. Now I'm sitting in my living room looking at the walls that used to hide such an awful secret, and they're just walls to me. The couch is comfortable and the TV works, and my coffee table has a normal amount of clutter on it like mail and magazines. The house that brought me such horror turned into the place where I learned I was stronger than I ever knew I could be. I won't ever forget what happened or pretend it didn't change me, but I've learned how to carry it without letting it crush me every single day. You know, I keep wondering if she really sees those walls as just walls now, or if there's still something hidden under everything she's trying to build back into a normal life. Hard to say, but it definitely makes you think. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments. Thanks for hanging out with me on this one. It's been a ride, and I'm glad we got to share these moments together. I'll catch you in the next one. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.